In the dusty chronicles of the American West, there are stories of gunfighters and gold rushes of railroad barons and cattle drives. But the most powerful tales are often the ones whispered by the wind, etched not in history books, but in the memory of the mountains themselves. This is one such story. It's the account of a forgotten pact, a debt of blood paid a generation later in the shadow of the jagged peaks. It's the story of Elara Vance, a 17-year-old orphan with nothing to her name but a small cabin and a fierce will to survive. And it's the story of how one night her defiant act of kindness in the face of certain death set her against a tide of 400 warriors, changing the fate of a land and everyone in it. What you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that the truest strength isn't found in a loaded pistol, but in a courageous heart. The cold came down from Widow's Grief Pass like a predator. It was a sharp, biting cold that found its way through the chinks in the logs of Elara Vance's small cabin, a lonely sentinel perched on the edge of the sprawling Montana territory. At 17, Elara was a creature of this unforgiving landscape, molded by its harshness and its stark beauty. Her father, a prospector named Jebediah Vance, had been swallowed by a mine collapse 5 years prior. Her mother, a gentlewoman named Annalise, had been taken by lung fever the winter before, that leaving Elara with only the cabin, a worn-out hunting rifle, and a silver locket that never left her neck. Loneliness was a constant companion, a quiet hum beneath the whisper of the pines and the cry of the hawk. The nearest sign of civilization, the ramshackle town of Redemption Gulch, was a hard half-day's ride away, a place she avoided. Its people looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. An orphan girl living alone was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven, brutal fabric of frontier life. This night the wind carried more than just the promise of snow. It carried a sound that made the fine hairs on Elara's arms stand on end, the frenzied, yipping chorus of coyotes. This wasn't their usual nightly song, a lonely call and response across the valley. This was the sound of a pack, closing in the manic excitement of a kill. Elara pulled her worn wool shawl tighter. Most folks would bolt the door and add another log to the fire. But her father had taught her to listen, to understand the land's language. This wasn't the sound of them chasing a rabbit or a deer. There was a desperation in it, a savagery that was different. And beneath the cacophony of the coyotes, she thought she heard something else. A low, guttural sound, almost human. Curiosity, or perhaps a deep-seated defiance against the wilderness that had taken everything from her, won out. Grabbing the old rifle and a flickering lantern, she unbarred the heavy plank door and stepped into the biting darkness. The lantern's light pushed back the shadows, revealing the skeletal dance of the aspen trees. She followed the sound, her worn leather boots crunching on the frosted earth, the rifle held steady in her hands. She found them less than a quarter-mile from her cabin, in a small rocky clearing. The pack, a dozen or more of them, with their mange-ridden coats and glowing eyes, swarmed a figure on the ground. They were a writhing mass of teeth and fur darting in to tear and rip, then jumping back. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The figure was a man, an Indian warrior. He was trying to rise on one elbow, a broken arrow shaft protruding gruesomely from his shoulder. His other hand weakly held a knife, its blade slick with the blood of 2 coyotes that lay dead nearby. But his strength was gone. His face, painted with symbols she didn't recognize, was a mask of exhausted pain. He was going to die here, torn to pieces and scattered across the unforgiving rocks. Something inside Elara, a spark of her mother's compassion that the wilderness hadn't yet extinguished, flared to life. These were the same creatures that scavenged the graves of lonely prospectors, the same howls that had been the soundtrack to her darkest nights of grief. She would not let them have him. Raising the rifle, she took a steadying breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. The boom of the shot was a thunderclap that shattered the night, echoing off the stone walls of the pass. One of the larger coyotes crumpled. She worked the lever action, the shuck, click, a familiar, comforting sound. Another shot, and a second coyote fell. The pack, momentarily stunned by the sudden violence from the shadows, hesitated. They were cowards at heart, bullies who preyed on the weak. "Get on, go on now." Elara screamed, her voice raw and surprisingly fierce. She strode forward, swinging the lantern, its arc of light making their eyes gleam like demonic embers. "Get out of here, you devils!" They scattered. One by one they broke from the attack, melting back into the darkness from which they came, leaving behind only the dead and the dying. Silence descended heavy and absolute. The only sounds were the ragged gasps of the wounded warrior and Elara's own pounding heart. She stood over him, the lantern held high. He was young, not much older than her, with a strong jaw and long black hair matted with blood and dirt. His eyes, dark and deep, found hers. They held no fear, only a flicker of exhausted surprise. Then his head fell back against the cold ground, and his eyes slid shut. Elara Vance, the orphan of Widow's Grief Pass, was now alone in the dark with a dying warrior, the smell of blood and gunpowder hanging heavy in the freezing air. The consequences of her action had not yet begun to dawn on her. For a long moment, Elara stood frozen, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had just intervened in a matter that was not her own, saving a man who belonged to a people her town feared and hated. The townsfolk in Redemption Gulch spoke of the Stone Eagle tribe in hushed, fearful tones. They were ghosts of the mountains, fierce warriors who kept to themselves, but were known to defend their lands with deadly force. Bringing one of them into her home was an act of madness. Leaving him here to die, however, was an act of cruelty she couldn't stomach. "Hell and damnation, Elara, what have you done?" she whispered to herself, her breath pluming in the cold. The warrior groaned, a sound of pure agony that cut through her hesitation. He was bleeding profusely from the wound, where the arrow had been snapped off, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The coyote bites were vicious, deep gashes on his arms and torso. He wouldn't last another hour in the freezing cold. With a grunt of effort, she knelt beside him. He was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle and solid bone. She knew she couldn't carry him. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She grabbed him under his arms, his skin surprisingly hot with fever, and began to drag him. It was a torturous journey back to the cabin. She pulled her boots, slipping on loose scree, her muscles screaming in protest. He was a dead weight, slipping in and out of consciousness, occasionally groaning as his broken leg bumped against a rock. The scent of his blood was coppery and thick in the air. By the time she hauled him over the threshold of her cabin, she was drenched in sweat despite the cold her arms burning with exhaustion. She laid him on the bearskin rug before the hearth, the only place large enough, and immediately set about stoking the fire. As warmth began to fill the small one-room cabin, she could finally assess the damage. It was worse than she'd thought. The arrow shaft was the most immediate problem. It was lodged deep in the muscle above his collarbone. Her father had taught her how to deal with wounds, a grim necessity of frontier life. Taking a deep breath, she heated the tip of her skinning knife in the flames until it glowed red. She could feel his eyes on her, hazy with pain, but intensely focused. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I have to get this out." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the meaning behind the glowing knife and her resolute expression. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly deft. She cut away the deerskin tunic, exposing the wound. With a pair of pliers, she gripped the slick, bloody shaft. He inhaled sharply, his whole body tensing, but he did not cry out as she pulled. The arrowhead, a cruelly barbed piece of flint, tore flesh as it came free. A fresh torrent of blood followed. Immediately she pressed a wad of clean linen against it, applying pressure until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Next came the coyote bites. She cleaned them with whiskey from her father's old flask, an act that made the warrior hiss in pain, his knuckles white as he gripped the floorboards. Then she turned to her mother's legacy, a wooden chest filled with dried herbs and remedies. Annalise Vance had been a woman who trusted the earth more than the saws and potions of any town doctor. Ilara crushed yarrow to pack into the wounds to stanch the bleeding, and ground willow bark, nature's own painkiller, into a poultice. As she worked, she saw the intricate tattoos on his arms, patterns of eagles and mountains. She saw the strength in his jaw, even slackened by pain. He was not just a man. He was someone of importance. A finely beaded pouch was still tied to his belt, and the eagle feather in his hair, though broken, was a mark of honor. The last, most difficult task was his leg. It was a clean break of the tibia, but it needed to be set. She found 2 sturdy pieces of wood from the kindling box and tore strips from her spare blanket. All right, she sighed more to herself than to him. Let's get this over with. She knelt by his leg, placing one hand below the break and one above. She looked at his face. His eyes were open again, watching her with a burning intensity. He seemed to be judging her, measuring her. Without warning, she pulled. A strangled cry, the first sound he'd made beyond a groan, was torn from his lips. There was a sickening pop as the bone slid back into alignment. He gasped, his body going rigid before slumping back, his eyes rolling into his head as he finally succumbed to the blackness of unconsciousness. Breathing heavily, Ilara quickly and tightly bound the splints to his leg. Her work was done. The cabin was a mess of bloody rags and the sharp medicinal smell of herbs. The warrior lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. She slumped into a chair, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked at the man on her floor. His presence filled the small cabin, changing it from a place of lonely solitude into something else, entirely, something dangerous and uncertain. As she watched the steady rise and fall of his chest in the firelight, her eyes fell upon the silver locket at her neck. She opened it, a nervous habit. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of her mother on one side, and on the other, a simple etching her father had carved for her, a single soaring eagle over a jagged peak. It was a symbol of the mountains that had given them a home and had ultimately taken her father from her. It was her only connection to the life that had been stolen away. Closing it with a soft click, she tucked it back beneath her collar, unaware of the profound significance of the simple design she carried so close to her heart. For 2 days the warrior drifted on a feverish tide. Ilara was a constant, tireless presence at his side. She spooned broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips, changed his dressings, and kept the fire roaring against the encroaching cold. During his bouts of delirium, he spoke in a language that was as musical and harsh as the land itself. She heard a single word repeated, a name spoken with reverence, and pain. Akecheta. She assumed it was his chief, or perhaps his father. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Ilara awoke from a light doze in her chair to find him watching her. The delirium was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clear, sharp intelligence. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken questions. "You're awake," she stated simply, rising to ladle some water into a tin cup. She approached him slowly, cautiously. He watched her every move. She knelt and offered him the cup. He hesitated for a moment before taking it, his fingers brushing against hers. He drank deeply, his throat working. He handed the cup back, his gaze unwavering. "You," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Keme." It was the first word he had spoken to her. "Keme." "Elara," she replied, touching her own chest. He nodded slowly, the name a strange sound on his tongue. Elara. Communication was a slow, painstaking process, built of gestures and single words. He pointed to his splintered leg, then gave a slight grimace, a silent thanks. She pointed to the empty pouch on her table, where she'd found the willow bark, then to her head, mimicking a headache going away. He seemed to understand. He was a quick study, his mind as sharp as his gaze. Later that day, as she was redressing the wound on his shoulder, he spoke again. Blackwood, he growled the name, coming out like a curse. He made a gesture of a rifle firing, then pointed to his shoulder and the dead coyotes outside, whose frozen carcasses she had dragged away from the cabin. Elara's blood ran cold. Silas Blackwood. She knew that name. Everyone in Redemption Gulch knew it. Blackwood was a man who had come to the territory with a bag full of money and a heart full of poison. He'd bought up the old Henderson claim and hired a dozen rough men prospectors and hired guns to work it. He was notoriously cruel, known for cheating his workers and for his violent hatred of the local tribes whose ancestral lands he believed were hiding a motherlode of gold. He saw them as nothing more than obstacles. Suddenly the broken arrow made sense. It wasn't one of Keme's own. It was from a cheap, common hunting set, the kind Blackwood's men would use. They hadn't just wounded him. They'd ambushed him, snapped off the arrow and left him for the scavengers. It was an act of calculated, contemptuous cruelty. A new, more chilling fear began to creep into Elara's mind. She hadn't just saved a warrior. She had saved a witness to an attempted murder by one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the region. Her isolated cabin was no longer a sanctuary, it was a hiding place. That afternoon, a fragile peace settled in the cabin. Keme was strong, his body already fighting to heal. He sat propped up against the wall, watching her as she went about her daily chores, chopping wood, kneading dough for bread. The silence was no longer tense, but comfortable. As she worked, the silver locket swung free from her collar. Keme's eyes, which missed nothing, locked onto it. He squinted, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher crossing his face. He gestured towards it. "Show me." Warily, Elara moved closer. She unclasped the chain and handed the locket to him. He handled it with a strange reverence, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He opened the clasp. He glanced at the faded portrait of her mother, but his full attention was on the other side, the simple etching of the eagle over the mountain peak. He traced the design with his thumb, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. He looked from the etching to Elara's face, then back to the etching. A look of dawning, incredulous recognition spread across his features. "Where?" he began, his English slow and deliberate. "Did you get this?" "My father carved it for my mother," Elara explained. "It's just a picture of the mountains." Keme shook his head slowly, a deep, resonant sound in his chest. "No, not just mountains. This is the mark of the Sun Giver." Elara stared at him, confused. "The Sun Giver I don't understand." Before Kem could explain, a new sound intruded, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. It was a low, distant rumble like far-away thunder, but the sky was crystal clear. Elara rushed to the window, peering out towards Widow's Grief Pass. The rumbling grew, vibrating through the floorboards of the cabin. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse or even a dozen. It was the sound of an army. Her heart leapt into her throat. She looked at Keme. His face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were grim. He knew what was coming. His people had found him. The earth began to tremble. It was a deep, visceral vibration that worked its way up from the soles of Ilara's boots and into her very bones. The sound was no longer a rumble. It was a roar, the thunder of 1,000 drums beating in unison. Peering through the small, grimy pane of glass in her window, Ilara saw them. They came over the ridge of Widow's Grief Pass, not as a group, but as a flood. A wave of men and horses, dark against the pale morning sky. They were a river of raw, untamed power, pouring down the mountainside and into the valley. At their head rode a figure of immense presence, his eagle feather war bonnet, a crown of fierce authority against the horizon. Ilara counted until her mind could no longer keep track. There were hundreds, maybe 400, maybe more. Warriors, all of them armed with rifles, bows and lances that glinted in the cold sunlight. Their faces were grim-painted for war. They moved with a terrifying silent purpose, their horses' hooves the only sound in the world. They weren't heading for her cabin. Not yet. They were flowing towards the main trail, the only artery that connected Redemption Gulch to the outside world. Methodically, silently, they formed a line, a living wall of flesh and steel that stretched from one side of the valley to the other, completely and utterly blocking the pass. Down in Redemption, Gulch panic erupted. The first prospector to spot the war party came galloping back into town, his face white with terror, screaming about an uprising. Doors were slammed shut, windows barred. Men grabbed their rifles and pistols, their bravado from the night before, in the saloon, evaporating into stark fear. Sheriff Brodie Thompson, a weary man with a drooping mustache, and eyes that had seen too much, stood on the porch of his office watching the impossible unfold through his spyglass. He was a decent man, trying to keep a fragile peace in a lawless land. But this was beyond him. This wasn't a drunken brawl or a dispute over a gold claim. This was an act of war. Silas Blackwood stormed out of the saloon, his face purple with rage. His dozen hired guns fanned out behind him. "What in God's name is this, Brodie?" Blackwood bellowed his voice, accustomed to being obeyed. "Are you just going to stand there? That's the Stone Eagle tribe. They've blocked the pass. They're trapping us in here. I can see that, Silas." Sheriff Thompson replied calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "And I suggest you and your men lower your weapons before you get us all killed." Killed. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "They're the ones who are going to get killed. They've just signed their own death warrant. This is the excuse I've been waiting for. We'll ride out there and wipe them off the face of this earth. Their land will be mine by sunset." "You'll do no such thing," the sheriff said, his voice hardening. "You ride out there, and you're starting a war I can't finish." Something provoked this Silas. This isn't their way. They don't make a move this bold without a grave reason. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something unease perhaps crossed his face before being replaced by his usual arrogance. The only reason they need is their savage nature. "Now are you going to deputize my men, or are we going to handle this ourselves?" Up in the lonely cabin, Ilara watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. She was trapped between a town that would see her as a traitor and an army of warriors who didn't yet know she was the reason their lost son was still alive. She turned from the window to look at Keme. He had dragged himself to the doorway, using the frame for support. He stood tall and proud, despite his injuries, watching his people. There was no surprise on his face, only a grim satisfaction. "They have come," he said, his voice low. They've blocked the pass, Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. They're going to attack the town. Keme shook his head. No, not the town. He looked from the war party in the distance to her, his gaze intense. They search for me, and they hunt the man who did this. He pointed to his shoulder. Blackwood. The terrible truth of the situation dawned on Ilara. The 400 warriors were not there for a random act of aggression. It was a meticulously planned military maneuver. They had sealed the valley. They had created a cage, and Silas Blackwood was the rat trapped inside. And her tiny, isolated cabin was right in the middle of it all. Just then, a smaller group of riders broke off from the main line, about 20 of them led by the formidable chief in the war bonnet. They weren't heading for the town, they were heading directly for her cabin. The ground began to shake again as they galloped closer, their purpose clear and terrifying. They were coming for her. The 20 riders approached, not with the thunderous charge of an attack, but with the unnerving, deliberate pace of a judge's procession. They fanned out, forming a semicircle around the cabin, their horses snorting plumes of steam in the cold air. Each warrior was a statue of lethal intent, his eyes fixed on the small log structure. They were a silent, intimidating jury. The chief at their center dismounted. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, tall and broad, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles and deep-seated wisdom. This had to be Akacheta, the name Keme had uttered in his fever. He moved with an unhurried grace that radiated absolute authority. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the cabin, taking in the wisp of smoke from the chimney, the neatly stacked firewood, and the single set of fresh tracks in the dirt. Inside, Ilara's courage deserted her. Her hands trembled, and her blood ran like ice water in her veins. This was it. They would see the signs of a struggle, the blood she had tried to scrub from the floorboards. They would find Keme see his wounds and assume she was in league with his attackers. They would burn her cabin to the ground and leave her for the Coyotes, a fitting and brutal irony. "Stay back," she whispered to Keme, pushing him away from the door. "They'll kill you if they see you like this. They'll kill us both." Keme held his ground, his grip firm on the doorframe. "They are my people. This is my father." His father. The word hung in the air heavy with significance. She had not just saved a warrior. She had saved the son of the great chief Akacheta. The heavy thud of a fist on the plank door made her jump. It wasn't an angry knock, but a firm, commanding summons. There was no escape. Taking a shaky breath, Ilara unlatched the bar and pulled the door open, squinting in the bright, cold sunlight. Akacheta stood before her, flanked by 2 of his fiercest-looking warriors. He was even more imposing up close. He said nothing, his obsidian eyes boring into her, searching her face, her soul. He was reading her story in the lines of fear and exhaustion around her eyes, in the tremor of her hands. His gaze dropped to a dark stain on the hem of her dress. Blood. His eyes hardened. One of his warriors growled something in their native tongue, taking a step forward, his hand tightening on the rifle in his grasp. This was the moment of judgment. Ilara's mind raced. What could she possibly say or do? Before she could speak, a voice came from behind her, weak but clear. "Father." Akacheta's stoic mask shattered. His eyes widened, and he looked past Ilara into the shadows of the cabin. A collective gasp went through the assembled warriors as Keme, leaning heavily on the doorframe, pulled himself into view. He was pale and injured, but he was alive. Akacheta strode forward, pushing past Ilara as if she were a ghost. He gripped his son's shoulders, his eyes scanning his wounds, the bandaged shoulder, the splintered leg, the raw healing gashes from the coyote bites. He spoke rapidly to Keme, his voice a torrent of urgent questions. Keme answered his voice, gaining strength with every word. He recounted the ambush, the name, Blackwood, being left for dead, the circling coyotes. And then he looked directly at Ilara. He spoke her name and pointed to the rifle leaning by the door. He pointed to the empty pouch of willow bark, to the clean bandages. As Keme spoke, the atmosphere outside the cabin transformed. The suspicion in the warriors' eyes turned to confusion, then to astonishment. They looked from the wounded son of their chief to this small, pale-faced girl who stood alone and trembling before them. Akacheta turned his gaze back to Ilara. The hardness was gone, replaced by a profound, searching gravity. He looked at her not as an enemy or an obstacle, but as a puzzle he could not comprehend. He stepped towards her, his sheer size blocking out the sun. He raised a hand, and she flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, his rough, calloused finger gently touched the silver locket at her throat, which had become visible when her collar fell open. He said something to Keme, a quiet, questioning word. Keme nodded and spoke to Ilara. "My father asks to see it." Her hands shaking, Ilara unclasped the locket and held it out. Akacheta took it in his massive palm, his hand dwarfing the delicate piece of silver. He opened it, and his breath hitched. He stared at the carving of the eagle over the mountain peak, his face a storm of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a dawning sacred awe. He looked up from the locket, his eyes locking with hers. He spoke his voice, a deep, powerful rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Keme translated his own voice, filled with wonder. "He says this mark is not seen in many lifetimes. It is the sign of the Sun Giver, the one who brings life back from the darkness. He asks how you came by it." "My father," Ilara stammered. "He carved it for my mother, Annalise. It was just a symbol of our home." Akacheta's eyes widened at the name. Annalise, he repeated the name, sounding foreign but wholly on his tongue. He began to speak no longer to Kem, but to all his warriors, his voice ringing with the power of an oral historian telling a sacred tale. The story poured from him, a memory from a time before Ilara was even born. Keme listened, his face rapt, and then he turned to Ilara to translate the impossible truth. Many winters ago, Keme began, my father was a young warrior like me. He was caught in a rock slide during a hunt. His leg was crushed. He was dying. A woman, a white woman with hair like spun straw, found him. She set his leg, gave him herbs for the pain, and sheltered him in a small line shack until his people could find him. Before she left, she gave him a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth. On the cloth she had drawn a picture, an eagle over a mountain. She was your mother. Ilara stared, speechless. Her mother, the gentle, quiet woman she remembered, had done this. It was a part of her life. She had never known a secret she had carried to her grave. Akacheta closed the locket and pressed it gently back into Ilara's hand. He placed his other hand on her shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. The debt is old. Keme translated his father's words, echoing with the weight of generations. A son for a son, a life for a life. The Sun Giver's daughter has saved my son. The debt is paid, but our fight is not with you. Akacheta's eyes turned cold and hard, looking past her, down the mountain toward Redemption Gulch. It is with the man who hunts in our lands and leaves our sons to be eaten by coyotes. It is with Blackwood. Down in Redemption Gulch, Silas Blackwood was pacing like a caged wolf. The sight of the chief's party riding up to the orphan girl's cabin and then returning to the main line without a single arrow being fired had infuriated and confused him. Something was wrong. The narrative he was trying to sell of a savage, unprovoked uprising wasn't holding. Sheriff Brodie Thompson had refused to be baited, instead posting men to keep the townsfolk from doing anything stupid. Blackwood's mind, always turning, always looking for an angle, began to work. That girl, the Vance orphan. What was her part in this? His men had assured him they had left the warrior for dead miles from anywhere. It was impossible that she could have found him, unless she was a sympathizer, a traitor. The idea took root, twisting into a dark and useful shape. He didn't need to fight 400 warriors. He just needed a pawn. "Jacobson, Miller," he barked at two of his grimiest-looking thugs. "Ride out, circle around the West Ridge. Stay out of sight of that main line. Get to the Vance girl's cabin. I want her. Bring her to me. Alive. We're going to have ourselves a little parley." His men looked at him, then at the formidable line of warriors blocking the pass. "Ride out there, boss. Are you crazy?" "They're focused on the pass," Blackwood snarled. "Their chief is back. They're waiting. They won't be watching the high rocks. Now go." He then stormed over to the sheriff's office. "Brodie, I know what this is about. That girl up in the hills, Ilara Vance, she's in league with them. She must have helped the warrior my men encountered. She's a traitor harboring a hostile. You have to go up there and arrest her. It's the only way to show them we're on the side of the law." Sheriff Thompson looked at Blackwood with weary disgust. He knew Silas was lying. He could smell it on him like cheap whiskey and greed. But the accusation, however false, was dangerous. It gave the scared and angry townsfolk a target for their fear. "I'll handle this, Silas," the sheriff said, grabbing his hat and shotgun. "You and your men stay put, that's an order." As the sheriff began the slow ride up the mountain, Jacobson and Miller were already moving their horses, picking their way through the treacherous rocky terrain of the West Ridge, a path only a desperate or foolish man would take. Up at the cabin, a tense calm had settled. Akacheta and his riders had returned to the line, but 2 warriors had been left behind, posted as silent, motionless guards near the tree line. It was a gesture of protection, but it felt to Ilara like she was a prisoner in her own home. Kem was sitting up his back against the wall, sipping a broth she had made. The revelation about her mother had changed everything. A bond forged not just in blood and willow bark, but in history now existed between them. "Your mother was very brave," Kem said quietly. I never knew," Ilara confessed. She never spoke of it. "Some acts of the heart are too great for words," he replied. Their quiet moment was shattered by the splintering crack of the cabin's back window. A rock flew through, followed by the barrel of a rifle. Before Ilara could scream, a rough hand grabbed her from behind, yanking her backwards. It was Jacobson, his breath foul, his grip like iron. Miller clambered through the broken window, his own pistol leveled at Kem. "Don't even think about it, Redskin," Miller sneered, gesturing with his gun. Keme's eyes blazed with fury. He tried to push himself up, but his splintered leg made him clumsy. He was a lion, but he was wounded and trapped. "What do you want?" Ilara cried, struggling against Jacobson's hold. "Boss wants a chat," Jacobson grunted, dragging her towards the door. "Seems you've made some powerful new friends. He wants an introduction." They were going to use her as a shield, a hostage, a bargaining chip. Suddenly the 2 warriors Akacheta had left as guards exploded from the trees. They moved with the silent speed of striking snakes. One launched an arrow that thudded into the doorframe inches from Miller's head, making him cry out and duck back. The other charged Jacobson, a tomahawk appearing in his hand as if by magic. Jacobson panicked, shoved Ilara away, and raised his rifle, but the warrior was too fast. He sidestepped and brought the flat of his tomahawk down on Jacobson's wrist. Bones crunched, and the rifle clattered to the ground. The warrior kicked it away and stood over the whimpering man, his face a mask of cold fury. Inside, Miller saw his partner go down and made a fatal mistake. He turned his pistol away from Kem for a split second to fire wildly through the doorway. In that instant, Keme acted. Ignoring the searing pain in his leg, he lunged, not with his fists, but with his good shoulder, hitting Miller square in the chest. The gunman flew backwards, his head cracking against the stone hearth. He crumpled to the floor unconscious. The fight was over in less than 10 seconds. Just as the dust settled, another rider appeared. It was Sheriff Brodie Thompson, his shotgun held at the ready. He skidded his horse to a halt, taking in the scene. Ilara pale but unharmed. Keme standing over the unconscious form of Miller. One warrior disarming Jacobson, while the other had an arrow nocked and aimed squarely at the sheriff's heart. "Hold your fire!" the sheriff yelled, raising a hand. "I'm not here to fight." The warrior's aim didn't waver. Ilara found her voice. "He's the lawkeeper," she called out to the warrior, her voice shaking. "He's not with them." Keme barked a sharp command. The warrior reluctantly lowered his bow, though his eyes remained fixed on the sheriff. Sheriff Thompson dismounted slowly, his eyes wide, with the understanding of what he had just ridden into. He looked at Blackwood's 2 thugs, then at Ilara, and finally at the proud, wounded warrior who stood defiant in the cabin doorway. "Blackwood sent them for you, didn't he?" the sheriff asked Ilara, his voice grim. Ilara nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "He wanted a hostage." The sheriff sighed, the full, rotten truth of the situation finally clear. This wasn't an Indian uprising. This was the result of Silas Blackwood's own venomous actions. And now Blackwood had escalated things by trying to kidnap the one person the Stone Eagle tribe had a reason to protect. "He's a fool," the sheriff muttered, looking down at the valley where the line of 400 warriors waited patiently. "He's not just trapping himself. He's signing his own death certificate." The sun began its slow, majestic descent, setting the jagged peaks of the mountains ablaze in hues of fiery orange and deep violet. The air grew colder, sharper. Down in the valley, the immense patience of the 400 warriors was a tangible thing, a weight on the land. It was the patience of a predator, absolute and finite. Sheriff Brodie Thompson knew he was standing on a knife's edge. He was a man of the law, but his law felt thin and brittle against the ancient, unyielding justice represented by the silent army below. He could retreat, let Blackwood be consumed by the fire he'd started, and pray the flames didn't spread to Redemption Gulch. Or he could stand for the tin star on his chest, even if it meant walking into the heart of that fire. He turned to Keme, his expression grave. "Keme." He began, his voice steady, despite the tremor he felt inside. "What Blackwood did was an act of savagery. It was against my law, just as it was against yours. If you give me these 2 men," he gestured to the bound and groaning forms of Jacobson and Miller, "I will ride down there, and I will arrest Silas Blackwood for his crimes. I give you my word." The 2 Stone Eagle warriors flanking Keme bristled at the suggestion. The taller of the 2, his face a mask of contempt, spat on the ground near the sheriff's boots and uttered a sharp, guttural phrase. Keme's gaze was hard questioning. "He says a white man's word is a breath of wind. It cannot be held. It cannot be trusted." "Some words can," Ilara said, stepping forward. Her voice was quiet, but carried an unexpected weight. She looked directly at the hostile warrior, then at Keme. "My mother gave her word to a wounded man many years ago. She kept it. A promise is a promise, no matter the language it is spoken in." She then turned her gaze to the sheriff. "And Sheriff Thompson is a man who keeps his. He is not like Blackwood." The sheriff met her gaze, a flicker of surprise, and gratitude in his weary eyes. She was vouching for him for the very idea of a law he himself sometimes doubted. Keme considered her words, his eyes moving between Ilara's earnest face and the sheriff's resolute one. He was being asked to forsake the swift, clean justice of the blade for a slower, more complicated path. It went against his every instinct, yet he saw the trust Ilara had placed in him, a stranger she had pulled from the jaws of death. He saw how that single act of trust had unearthed a bond a generation old. Perhaps this was a new way. A way to prove his people were not the savages Blackwood claimed them to be, but a nation of honor. After a long, tense silence that stretched the nerves of every person present, Kame gave a sharp, decisive nod. "We will do this," he announced, speaking to his warriors as much as to the sheriff. "We will see if this law-keeper's word is as strong as a mountain stone." He then locked eyes with Thompson. "You will take them. You will bring us Blackwood. If you fail, the sun will not set on your town. It will set on its ashes." The deal was struck. The two warriors, their faces still grim with doubt, loaded Blackwood's thugs onto their horses. Sheriff Thompson, his jaw set, turned his horse and began the ride back down to Redemption Gulch, a lone lawman carrying the fate of his entire town on his shoulders. The news of the agreement and the reason for it spread through the line of warriors like a grass fire. The tale of the Sun-Giver's daughter, the locket, and the debt paid across a generation was passed from man to man in hushed, reverent tones. When Ilara, with Kemme leaning on her for support, emerged from the cabin to watch the sheriff's descent, a low murmur rippled through the ranks. It was not a sound of aggression, but of profound respect. They looked at her now, this small girl in a worn dress, and saw not an outsider, but a living piece of their own sacred history. Down in town, the powder keg was close to exploding. The sheriff's return with Blackwood's captured men sent a shock wave through the terrified populace. Brody didn't waste a moment. He deputized 3 of the town's most steadfast men, a burly blacksmith and 2 grim-faced ranchers, and marched directly to the saloon. Inside, Silas Blackwood was holding court, his arrogance fueled by whiskey. He was surrounded by his 10 remaining hired guns, trying to incite them into a suicidal charge. "We ride out there and break them. We show these savages what real power looks like." The saloon doors swung open with a crash. "It's over, Silas." Sheriff Thompson announced, his shotgun leveled. Blackwood spun around his face, contorting in a sneer. "Brody, have you lost your mind, arresting my men?" "Silas Blackwood," the sheriff's voice boomed, silencing the room. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Keme of the Stone Eagle and the kidnapping of Ilara Vance." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're insane. You have no proof. Men, he's sided with them. Kill him." 10 pistols were drawn. The 3 new deputies raised their own rifles, the blacksmith's knuckles white on the stock of his buffalo gun. A bloody shootout was milliseconds away. "Hold it!" Thompson yelled, his voice cutting through the tension. He wasn't looking at Blackwood's men. He was looking past them at the frightened faces of the ordinary townsfolk, peering over the bar and from behind tables. "You see that army on the pass? They're not here for you. They're here for him." He pointed a finger at Blackwood. "His greed is about to get every man, woman, and child in this town killed. You can die for his gold, or you can live for your families. Make your choice. Right now." Silence. The hired guns looked at each other, then at the stone-cold certainty on the sheriff's face. They were paid thugs, not martyrs. One by one, their pistols were slowly, reluctantly lowered. Their loyalty was only as deep as Blackwood's coin, and it wasn't worth dying for. Blackwood stood alone, his support evaporating like a puddle in the desert sun. "You'll regret this," he snarled, his face pale with fury and fear as the sheriff kicked his pistol away and clamped the cold iron of the handcuffs on his wrists. The final act played out on the dusty trail at the edge of town in the eerie twilight. The entire population of Redemption Gulch watched from a safe distance as Sheriff Thompson led Blackwood on foot toward the waiting line of warriors. Akacheta had ridden forward alone to meet them, a figure of immense, immovable authority. Elara and Keme watched from the hillside above the whole tragic panorama spread out before them. Elara felt a strange mix of pity and vindication as she watched the arrogant Silas Blackwood stumble in the dirt, now just a man stripped of his power and facing his reckoning. There was no battle. There was only the quiet, solemn transfer of justice. The sheriff handed the rope binding Blackwood's hands over to Akacheta. The chief took the rope, his eyes like chips of flint, as they locked with Blackwood's terrified gaze. "The law of your people has found you guilty, Taiti." Akacheta said, his English perfect and cold. "Now you will face the justice of ours. We will take you to the place where you left my son for the Coyotes. You will be given a knife. The Coyotes will be given their hunger. The gods of the mountain will decide if you see the dawn." Akacheta turned, leading his prisoner back toward the war party. As he passed the hillside where Keme and Elara stood, he paused. He looked at his son with immense pride. Then his gaze fell upon Elara and the silver locket that hung openly on her chest. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a single perfect eagle feather. Its tip was dyed a deep, vibrant crimson, the color of lifeblood. He held it out to her. "The debt is paid," he said, his voice softer now. "But honor remains. The Stone Eagle people do not forget. This feather is your mark. It tells the story of this day. With it, you are one who is owed honor. You may walk our lands, drink from our streams, and find shelter in our camps. The Sun-Giver's daughter will always have a place by our fire." Elara took the feather, its lightness a stark contrast to the immense weight of its meaning. It was a treaty, a passport, a promise of peace in a land that knew so little of it. With a final meaningful look at his son, Akacheta turned and mounted his horse. The line of warriors, their purpose fulfilled, parted like a curtain. With Silas Blackwood in their midst, they turned and rode back up into Widow's Grief Pass, their forms silhouetted against the last dying rays of the sun. They vanished into the mountains as silently and mysteriously as they had come, leaving only the thunder of their memory behind. The pass was open. The war was over. In the profound silence that descended, Elara Vance stood with the son of the chief, the sheriff's profound gratitude behind her, and an eagle feather clutched in her hand. She was no longer the lonely orphan of the pass. She was a bridge between two worlds, a hero forged in kindness, a legend whispered on the wind. And so the legend of Elara Vance, the Sun-Giver's daughter, was etched into the history of that rugged corner of the West. It serves as a powerful reminder that history isn't just shaped by armies and grand events, but by small defiant acts of compassion. Elara didn't seek glory or recognition. She simply chose kindness in a moment of darkness, and in doing so, she rewrote the future. Her story proves that courage has many faces, and that the deepest debts are not of gold, but of the spirit. A single act of saving one life ended up saving hundreds, forging a peace that outlasted the gold rushes and the gunfights. These are the kinds of stories we risk losing to time. If this tale of bravery, honor, and an unlikely bond moved you, please help us keep these legends alive. Hit that like button, Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the forgotten annals of the Wild West. Your support helps us unearth the voices of the past and share them with the world. Thank you for listening.